At the $400 million signing gala, my husband brought his mistress and introduced her as his wife. My mother-in-law slapped me and told me to get lost, saying I was an eyesore. I walked over to the chairwoman of the partner conglomerate and said, "Mother, let them taste bankruptcy." The crystal chandelier on the ceiling of the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, brilliant as the Milky Way, cast sparkling streaks of light onto the polished marble floor. People walked about, laughing and talking, champagne flutes swirling in their hands, designer dresses brushing past each other amidst the scent of bespoke perfumes. In the midst of that extravagant space, I felt as out of place as an off-key keynote in a flawless symphony. Today was a momentous day for the Sterling Apex Group, the day of signing a commercial real estate contract worth $400 million a number, staggering enough to overwhelm anyone. But for me, Sloane, the wife of the young CEO Vance Sterling, this was just another evening in my 3 years of marriage. An evening where I knew I would be invisible again. My husband, Vance, was standing in the center of the ballroom, raising his glass, smiling radiantly beside his father and important partners. He wore a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, looking elegant and charismatic. But not once tonight did his eyes wander to where I was standing. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was even worse. She glided past me like a cold breeze. Her deep crimson Oscar de la Renta evening gown exuded pride and power exactly like her personality. She was busy greeting, shaking hands, and receiving compliments. In her world, I was just a superfluous decoration. I was used to it. Over the past 3 years, I had learned to get used to pouring my own sparkling water, finding a hidden corner to sit in, and smiling to myself under the scrutinizing gazes of Manhattan's elite. They looked at me, an ordinary-looking girl in a simple off-the-rack dress, and then at my husband, their eyes filled with an unspoken question. Why her? I used to think that if I just lived decently, obediently, and worked hard, people would eventually love me. But after 3 years, I began to understand that whether people love you or not has nothing to do with how you live. The climax of the evening, or rather the climax of my endurance, was when Vance led another woman by the hand into the center of attention. Her name was Cleo, a rising runway model with a striking figure, wearing an emerald sweetheart evening gown that hugged every curve of her body. She linked her arm intimately through Vance's, and without a hint of embarrassment, my husband introduced her to the high society crowd. "Let me introduce you all. This is Cleo, my soulmate." A few people politely clapped and a few looked at me with pity, but my husband didn't even glance in my direction. Eleanor stood nearby, and not only did she not stop him, but she also smiled with deep satisfaction. She nodded at Cleo, her eyes affectionate, as if this were the daughter-in-law she had always wanted. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Soulmate? Then what am I? The legal wife on paper, the person who gave up her career in architecture to stay home and care for his family, the person who stayed silent through all his late-night client dinners in Soho. And now I had become an outsider in my own marriage. I couldn't take it anymore. Taking a deep breath, I fought back the tears welling up in my eyes and walked toward them. I didn't scream or make a scene. I just stood in front of my husband, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Vance, could you explain this a bit? Isn't your wife still standing right here?" The whole room seemed to freeze. The melodic jazz quartet suddenly felt out of place, and all eyes turned toward us. Vance looked flustered. He detached Cleo's arm and stammered, "Sloane, don't. I don't make a scene here. We can talk when we get back to the penthouse." The penthouse? The home where I have never felt I belonged. Cleo stood beside him, smirking defiantly. She looked at me like I was a fool. But the person who ended it all wasn't my husband. It was my mother-in-law. Eleanor stepped forward, her beautifully contoured face hardening into authoritarian lines. Without a word, she swung her hand. A dry slap echoed, drowning out the ambient music. One side of my face burned, the pain excruciating. I clearly heard the gasps of shock from the Wall Street executives and socialites. I stood there, my neatly pinned hair now unraveled, a few strands hiding half of my face. I didn't shed a single tear, but my heart felt torn apart. Get lost, Eleanor hissed, her voice sharp as a surgical scalpel. Stop being an eyesore to me, you ungrateful little nobody. No one spoke up to defend me. My husband, the man I had loved and sacrificed for over 3 years, just stood there paralyzed. He looked at me, then at his mother, as if calculating which side would be easier to live with. I looked around at the eyes filled with pity, curiosity, and even gloating. Amidst hundreds of powerful people, I felt utterly alone. The physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation gnawing at my soul. They hit me, humiliated me, just because I dared to demand my rightful status. So in their eyes, I wasn't even worth as much as a centerpiece on the table. I slowly straightened up, my hand subconsciously touching my burning cheek. I didn't look at my husband, nor at the woman who had struck me. Instead, I smiled a strangely gentle smile. That smile didn't seem to belong to me, nor to someone who had just been publicly humiliated. It made Eleanor freeze, and the gloating look in the Mistress Cleo's eyes momentarily shift to panic. Then I turned. Every step of my stilettos clicked firmly and clearly against the marble floor. I wasn't walking toward the exit to Fifth Avenue. I was walking straight toward the VIP table, where the titans of industry were seated. All eyes followed my every step, curious and confused. Eleanor seemed to snap out of it. She barked, "Where do you think you're going? Leave immediately." But I paid no attention. My destination was right in front of me. The woman sitting in the center of the banquet table had her hair in a sleek chignon, and her jet-black vintage Dior dress exuded an indescribable elegance and authority. She had a kind face, but her eyes were piercingly sharp. That was Margot Kensington, chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings, the most important partner in Sterling Apex's $400 million mega development. From the beginning until now, she had silently observed everything, her face showing no emotion. I stopped right beside her chair. The entire ballroom held its breath. Behind me, my husband and mother-in-law seemed to sense something was terribly wrong. Their faces began to pale. I leaned down, my hair falling to cover part of my expression. Then in the silent space I called out softly, but loud enough for everyone at the VIP table to hear. "Mother," that word dropped like a bomb in the middle of the plaza. Everyone at the VIP table turned to look at me in shock. My husband, Vance, was rooted to the spot. The crystal flute in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Eleanor's jaw dropped, her eyes wide, unable to believe what she had just heard. Whispers erupted throughout the hall like a broken beehive. Margot looked up at me. In her sharp eyes, a flash of heartbreak and furious anger suddenly appeared. She said nothing, only giving a slight nod as a silent confirmation. I knew she understood. I leaned close to her, my voice a whisper, but chillingly cold, just loud enough for the executives nearby to shudder. Let them taste bankruptcy. As soon as I finished, I stood up straight. My mother, Margot, kept her face entirely composed, but her actions were incredibly decisive. She gave a slight nod to the chief of staff standing behind her. The executive immediately understood, walked onto the stage, and took the microphone from the bewildered host. His voice rang out clear and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings, Margot Kensington, I would like to make an urgent announcement. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we have officially decided to withdraw from the Sterling Apex Urban Redevelopment Project. All previous agreements and letters of intent are hereby void. Thank you and good evening." A brief statement, but its destructive power was greater than 1,000 insults. The entire hall was shaken. $400 million, the dream of the entire Sterling dynasty, the crown jewel of Apex, had shattered into smoke in a single moment. I saw my father-in-law, Richard Sterling, stagger, clutching the edge of a table. I saw Vance, his face as white as a sheet, looking at me with absolute horror and panic. And I saw Eleanor, the woman who had just screamed, "Get lost," at my face, now trembling, pointing a manicured finger at me, stammering incoherently. She rushed toward my mother, her contoured face now distorted with panic. She tried to force a strained smile, her voice trembling, stripped of all upper-crust authority. "Marotte, what nonsense is this girl saying? She's not right in the head, probably just having a nervous breakdown from stress. We are all family, whatever it is. Let's just step into a private suite and talk it out. I found it laughable. Just a few minutes ago, she treated me like a disease. Now she hastily claimed we were family. My mother merely glanced at Eleanor, her eyes as cold as a New York winter. She didn't respond to her, but turned to look at me, her voice calm, but full of fierce protection. My daughter, I understand. As for my son-in-law, today I have finally seen his true colors. That sentence contained no profanity, but it was like an invisible backhand squarely across Vance's and his entire family's faces. It was both an affirmation and a corporate death sentence. Only then did Vance seem to wake from a trance. He looked at me, his eyes no longer cold or disdainful, but filled with absolute terror. He rushed over, ignoring the stars of hundreds of Manhattan's elite, and suddenly dropped to his knees at my feet. The hands that wore a limited edition PC Philippe that signed billion-dollar contracts were now pathetically clutching the hem of my skirt. Sloane, I beg you, everything. Everything is just a terrible misunderstanding. Cleo and I are nothing, just colleagues. Please don't be angry. Don't do this, Sloane. His voice was choked with sobs, tears welling in his eyes. I looked at the man kneeling at my feet, the man I had once loved with all my heart. Now I felt nothing but disgust rising within me. Who was he putting on this act for? For me or for my mother, the billionaire holding the fate of his entire legacy in her hands? Why didn't he say these words when he introduced that woman as his soulmate? Why didn't he speak up when his mother slapped me? I quietly detached his hands and took a step back. I looked straight into his eyes. My voice as cold as my mother's gaze. Vance, stand up. You're a terrible actor in this play. You should save these words for your soulmate. I purposely emphasized the word soulmate, causing Cleo, who had been standing, frozen the whole time, to turn a few shades paler. I didn't want to stay in this suffocating place a second longer. I turned to my mother and gave a slight nod. My mother stood up, draped her cashmere wrap over her shoulders, and walked away with me. We walked through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea, past the amazed, curious, and panicked eyes of Vance's family. I didn't look back, but I could still hear Vance's desperate cries and Eleanor's frantic screams echoing off the marble pillars. But all those sounds to me now were just the echoes of a dead past. The Maybach glided through the Manhattan night, leaving behind the magnificent facade of the plaza and the unfinished tragic comedy. The streetlights flashed past the tinted windows, casting streaks of light and shadow on my face. Outside was the noisy, bustling city that never sleeps, but inside the car the silence was strangely profound. My mother didn't ask anything, she just held my hand, a warm, steady hand. It was that very handhold that caused the strong wall I had tried to build to collapse. Tears began to fall, not out of humiliation, but because I finally had a safe harbor to be vulnerable. The car didn't head to the modest walk-up apartment in Atoria, Queens, where I had lived with Vance for the first 2 years of our marriage, before he made it big. It headed toward the Upper East Side and stopped in front of a magnificent historic limestone townhouse hidden behind iron gates. This was my true home, the place where I grew up, where every little corner was filled with memories. For 3 years, I had voluntarily left this place, hiding my heiress identity in a shell, just to seek a love that I naively thought would remain untainted by money. As soon as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of fresh hydrangeas and beeswax polish made my heart settle. Everything was the same, from the contemporary art in the foyer to the soft cream sectionals. Only the human heart had changed. Mother brewed me a cup of chamomile tea and sat down beside me, her eyes full of sorrow. I shouldn't have let you do this foolish thing. I smiled sadly, the heat from the fine china warming my freezing hands. I just wanted a love that wasn't, because I'm the Vanguard heiress. I wanted someone to love me just for who I am. That was the reason I had begged my mother 3 years ago to let me hide my identity, living like an ordinary junior architect. And then I met Vance, a talented young project manager, with a warm smile. I thought I had found true love. I began to tell my mother about my 3 years living in that shell in the apartment that Eleanor constantly disparaged as a shoebox. About the elaborate dinners I spent all afternoon cooking. only to receive passive-aggressive complaints when they were served. About the times Vance came home late from entertaining clients, reeking of bourbon and women's perfume. When I asked, he would just gaslight me, telling me I was acting crazy. About the Hermes Birkins and Chanel jackets I had to hide deep in my closet, for fear my mother-in-law would call me a gold digger, draining her son's accounts. I had lived like an unpaid maid, a walking ATM for my husband's covert debts and a silent shadow in my own home. I endured it because I loved Vance and because I kept hoping that one day my devotion would be recognized. I thought I could use sacrifice as currency for happiness. But I was wrong. The meeker you are, the easier you are to despise. The more you endure, the more people cross the line. When my mother finished listening, she didn't cry, but a rare, terrifying anger flared in her eyes. She pulled me into a warm embrace, the embrace I had longed for over the past 3 years. My sweet girl, you've suffered enough. From now on, no one in this city will dare look down on you, I promise. I buried my head in her shoulder, my tears soaking her silk blouse. I cried for my naivety, cried for the 3 years of my 20s that had been trampled. My innocence had ultimately exacted an exorbitant price. The next morning, I woke up in my familiar canopy bed. The early sunlight peeked through the heavy drapes. The space was unusually quiet, a stark contrast to the sirens and street noise of Queens. For the first time in 3 years, I slept deeply without nightmares, without waking up with a start to my mother-in-law's demanding texts or Vance's phone buzzing in the middle of the night. I thought last night was just a nightmare, but the red swelling on my cheek was still there, a cruel reminder in the vanity mirror. I walked downstairs. Mother's private chef had already prepared breakfast, just a simple plate of homemade buttermilk waffles and fresh coffee, but it tasted incredibly delicious. Perhaps because it had been a long time since I could eat breakfast without rushing, without hearing bitter complaints about my calorie intake. While I was eating, my mother quietly placed an iPad on the marble island. I glanced at the headlines on the financial apps. They were all identical. Last-minute shock. Vanguard Holdings pulls plug on $400 million mega project with Sterling Apex. What is the future for Sterling Apex after the failed deal of the decade? Sterling stock plummets at the opening bell. Everything unfolded exactly as predicted. An empire built on leverage was now on the verge of collapse. In just one night, I scrolled through my phone. Business forums and Reddit threads were buzzing. People analyzed and speculated about the real reason behind the contract cancellation. Some said Sterling's financials were cooked. Others thought it was a hostile takeover attempt by a rival firm. But no one knew that the epicenter of this Wall Street earthquake stemmed from a single slap. I felt the first sweet taste of revenge, a creeping satisfaction in my heart when thinking of Vance and Eleanor's faces right now. But that feeling passed quickly, replaced by a strange emptiness. Would watching them file for Chapter 11 really make me happy? Could financial ruin erase the scars of 3 years of psychological abuse? I wasn't sure. I only knew that things couldn't stop here. This wasn't just about personal vendettas. It was about reclaiming my dignity for the years I had sacrificed meaninglessly. My phone started buzzing incessantly. It was Vance. He called over and over. When I didn't answer, he switched to iMessage. A barrage of blue bubbles flooded in, ranging from begging and pleading to emotional blackmail. Sloan, I know I was an idiot. Forgive me this once. It was all my mother's fault. I never wanted this. Do you know if we lose this Vanguard deal, my whole family is ruined? Are you really that vindictive? If you don't answer, I'll come to the townhouse to find you. I read every line, my heart completely undisturbed. Vindictive. He calls me vindictive. So, when he paraded a runway model around and introduced her as his soulmate, when his mother struck me across the face in front of New York's elite, where was their cruelty hidden? I didn't reply. I just quietly blocked his number. Once the initial shock passed, logic had to return. I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. The retaliation wasn't just about bankrupting Sterling Apex. There were complex legal issues regarding the divorce and equitable distribution of assets in New York State. I needed a shark, a brilliant and ruthless litigator. My mother agreed. She said she would point me to the top corporate and family law firm in Manhattan. The next day, following the address my mother gave me, I took the private elevator up to a law office, located in a sleek glass skyscraper in Midtown. The office was designed impeccably, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, but the lush potted fiddle leaf fig in the reception area gave it a grounding feel. As I was waiting, a man in a sharp charcoal suit walked out of a glass conference room. He was tall with a strong jawline, bright eyes behind tortoiseshell frames. "Sorry to keep you waiting. I am Declan, the senior partner who will be handling your case." The familiar cadence of his voice made me look up, and I was stunned. This face, this voice, though more mature and weathered, I still recognized him. "Declan, are you Declan Hayes from my undergrad cohort at Columbia?" I blurted out, unable to hide my surprise. The man in front of me also froze. He looked at me intently, and then a warm, genuine smile bloomed on his face. "Sloane, it really is you. It's been forever. I never expected we'd meet again under these circumstances." It turned out that the prestigious law firm my mother endorsed was co-founded by my old college friend. The world of Manhattan power players can be truly small sometimes. Meeting an old acquaintance greatly eased the initial tension. Declan invited me into his corner office. We sat and talked, reminiscing about our days at Columbia. I still remembered the Declan of the past. A brilliant scholarship student, always quiet and reserved, but the only person who stood up to defend me when I was harassed by a group of entitled frat guys. After graduation, we lost touch. I never imagined the intense, studious guy from years ago would become a heavyweight litigator. After catching up, we got down to business. I told Declan my entire story, from the reality of my 3-year marriage to the disaster at the plaza the night before. Declan listened very attentively without a single word of judgment, only offering a look of deep empathy and a fleeting, dangerous flash of anger when I mentioned the slap. When I finished, he remained silent for a long time, tapping his Mont Blanc pen on his legal pad before speaking. His voice was full of determination. "Sloane, rest assured I will utterly dismantle them for you. Not just because we are friends, but because I have my own reasons for wanting to see Sterling Apex burn." His words piqued my curiosity. But I didn't press. "I trust you." The way he looked at me still held that special protective care, just like years ago in the university library. Having a reliable ally by my side made me feel much more secure. I knew this battle would be a grueling legal war of attrition, but I was no longer alone. An alliance had been formed, and we were ready for discovery. A few days later, I met Declan again at his office. Outside the window, the Manhattan skyline was obscured by a gray drizzle. But inside my heart, there was a quiet, calculating pause. We already had our initial strategies for the divorce filings, ensuring Vance wouldn't get a dime of my premarital Vanguard trust. But Declan's words from the other day that he had a personal vendetta against Sterling kept lingering in my mind. I sensed that behind my case, there was another story, a deeper wound. After reviewing the financials, Declan pushed up his glasses, his gaze staring far away past the skyscrapers. He stayed silent for a long time, as if weighing his words. "Sloane, perhaps I should tell you the real reason. Dealing with Sterling isn't just pro bono work for me, it's a debt of blood." I didn't interrupt, just waited quietly. I knew this was not an easy story to unearth. Declan stood up, walked to the window, his hands unconsciously clenching into fists in his pockets. "That $400 million project, that luxury eco-community Sterling planned to build upstate. Do you know what land it sits on?" I shook my head. During my marriage, I had only vaguely heard Vance brag that it was a pristine plot in the Hudson Valley, prime real estate for wealthy weekenders, but I never looked into the zoning or acquisition. Declan's voice dropped, tinged with a distant sorrow. "It used to be a working farm, an apple orchard. It was where my maternal grandparents lived for their entire lives. The land wasn't massive, just enough for a farmhouse, a barn, and rows of Macintosh and Honeycrisp. My childhood, my summers were tied to that place, to the smell of cider and the quiet mornings. Listening, my heart tightened. An image of a peaceful pastoral life emerged. completely contrasting with the cutthroat corporate luxury I had just navigated. Declan continued, his jaw tight. 10 years ago, Vance's father, Richard Sterling, came looking for them. He talked about county development, eminent domain loopholes, promising fair market value, but then they used every dirty mob adjacent trick in the book to force the appraisal down and apply pressure. Gentle farmers who only knew their harvest their whole lives. How could they fight against a billionaire developer's legal army? My grandparents and a dozen other local families refused to sell. They held their ground because it was generational land, the blood, sweat, and tears of a century. But then Richard sent private fixers to intimidate them. One night, my grandmother's greenhouse was smashed to pieces. Another day, my grandfather's loyal shepherd dog was poisoned. My grandfather was so frustrated, so overwhelmed by the legal fees and harassment that he suffered a massive stroke. Finally, to pay off the medical debt to keep him alive, my grandmother had to bite the bullet and sign the deed over to a Sterling shell company for pennies on the dollar. Declan turned back to look at me, the unhidden pain etched into his sharp features. My grandfather didn't make it before he died in that hospital bed. He held my hand tightly, repeatedly telling me to study the law, so that one day I could demand justice for the people the system forgets. This debt isn't about equity, Sloan. It's a generational trauma. The repressed anger of honest people crushed by corporate greed. Declan's story blew through me like an Arctic wind, fanning the flames of resentment within me. But it also made my mind clearer and sharper than ever. I realized that to defeat a cunning syndicate like Richard and Vance Sterling, we couldn't just rely on family court and PR. We needed hard evidence of racketeering and to stay one step ahead of their fixers. Focusing intensely on the task helped me temporarily forget my personal betrayal, turning my grief into a tactical advantage. Declan and I sat down to draft a forensic plan. The battle would be fought on two fronts. I, with the advantage of having lived in their house for 3 years, would be responsible for providing internal breadcrumbs. Declan, with his subpoena power and investigative resources, would gather the hard proof. I began to dig through my memories, trying to string together fragmented pieces I had never paid attention to while playing the beautiful housewife. I recalled my father-in-law's late-night burner phone calls. He always went out to speak in hushed tones, but I still caught a few names repeated over and over. I remembered the times Vance came home late from networking, leaving crumpled receipts from underground poker games and exclusive gentlemen's clubs carelessly in his suit pockets. I remembered Eleanor casually boasting about her gifts to certain officials on the city's zoning board. Most notably, I remembered a figure named Silas, an intimidating man who my father-in-law occasionally met privately at a secluded cigar lounge in Tribeca. Every time he returned from meeting Silas, Richard looked intensely paranoid. I wrote down all those names, addresses, and seemingly harmless habits on a legal pad. 3 years of being treated like a piece of furniture had ironically given me a surveillance perspective no one else had. Those fragments of information might be the keys to unlocking Sterling Apex's RICO violations. Meanwhile, Declan began an even more grueling task. He sought to reconnect with the Hudson Valley families who had lost their land a decade ago. It wasn't easy. 10 years is a lifetime. Many had moved out of state, scattered everywhere. The few who remained carried an invisible, paralyzing fear. They had been crushed by money and muscle once, so they no longer dared to believe the system worked. Some hung up on him, some slammed their screen doors shut when they heard the name Sterling. But Declan wasn't deterred. He patiently visited each home, not in his tailored Tom Ford suits but in jeans and a jacket. As a grandson whose family was also destroyed, he shared his grandparents' story. He shared their pain over diner coffees. Gradually, the icy wall of fear and distrust began to melt. A few people started digging out old tax records, the falsified environmental reports Sterling had used. With each passing day, we gained a little more leverage, a few more paper trails. Declan's office slowly filled with plat maps, shell company dossiers, and red string. As we delve deeper into the investigation, the Starings began to make their countermoves. They couldn't just sit still and watch their stock tank and their secrets get probed. But I didn't expect their retaliation to be so physical and brazen. One evening, after leaving Declan's firm, I drove my Range Rover home. I parked in the townhouse's private underground garage. The space was silent with only the hum of the ventilation and my echoing footsteps. As I locked the car and turned toward the private elevator, a heavy figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, blocking my path. I startled, reflexively taking a step back. Under the fluorescent lights of the garage, I recognized the man. It was Silas, the fixer I had seen at the cigar lounge. Richard's go-to guy for making problems disappear. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but he was built like a cinder block, his face bearing a jagged scar across his jawline, his gaze dead and cold. "Evening, Mrs. Sterling, or should I say, Miss Kensington, you look different without the apron." His voice was a growly rasp carrying undisguised menace. I tried to stay calm, gripping my Birkin bag tightly, my thumb hovering over the panic button on my phone. "What do you want, Silas?" he sneered, a smile devoid of any warmth. He stepped closer, the strong stench of cheap cologne and stale tobacco wafting from him, making my stomach turn. "I just wanted to drop by and check on the boss's arranged daughter-in-law. I hear you've been very busy lately, meeting with big-shot lawyers, digging through public records upstate." "Why go through all that trouble, Sloane? I'm telling you this as a courtesy. Some graves shouldn't be dug up. Leave the past where it is. Fish can't survive in toxic waters. You're young, rich, you got a whole life of shopping ahead of you. Don't make things difficult for yourself over a bunch of dirt farmers." Every word he spoke was a veiled threat. He didn't raise his voice, but his chillingly calm demeanor made it all the more terrifying. I knew he wasn't making empty threats. In the New York real estate underworld, a man like him made people vanish, but the cold spike of fear was fleeting, quickly replaced by an even stronger resolve. If they had to resort to sending their bulldog, it proved Declan and I were on the right track. We had hit an artery. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Thank you for the unsolicited advice, but I know exactly what I'm doing. Now, step aside before I call my security detail." A flash of raw anger sparked in his dead eyes. He stared at me for a few agonizing seconds, then smirked, stepping back. "Have it your way. Seems you grew a spine. But remember, glass houses shatter easily. Let's hope you're smart enough to know when to walk away." With that, he blended back into the shadows toward the exit. I power-walked to the elevator, my hand shaking as I hit the button. I didn't look back, but I felt his gaze on me until the doors slid shut. Silas's threat was no empty talk. I knew that, but I couldn't have predicted they would strike so quickly or so lethally. A few days later, in the late evening, I had to drive across the RFK Bridge to meet an old municipal clerk Declan had finally tracked down in Queens. In the afternoon, a sudden nor'easter had rolled in, dumping torrential rain and making the asphalt incredibly slick. Traffic on the bridge was heavy, moving cautiously. As my SUV was descending the curve of the bridge, I lightly tapped the brakes to keep my distance from a semi-truck ahead. But something horrific happened. My brake pedal sank completely to the floorboard without an ounce of resistance. My heart leaped into my throat. The brakes were dead. With no stopping power, my heavy SUV began to hurtle forward down the incline, picking up speed. Blind panic seized my mind for a fraction of a second. Immediately, I forced myself to recall the defensive driving courses my father had made me take. I took my foot off the gas, pulled the electronic emergency brake, and slammed the transmission into a lower gear, praying the engine braking would slow the massive vehicle. The car violently fishtailed, the screech of the tires on the wet pavement deafening over the rain. Everything played out in slow motion. I saw the steel bumper of the semi-truck looming closer and closer. I violently yanked the steering wheel into the adjacent lane, hydroplaning and nearly clipping a yellow cab. Horns blared around me. Other drivers stared in horror. I just gritted my teeth, white-knuckling the leather steering wheel, desperately wrestling to control 2 tons of runaway metal. Finally, after a bone-jarring scrape against the concrete Jersey barrier, my car ground to a halt. The airbags deployed with a violent pop, punching the breath out of me and leaving me dazed. I sat motionless in the driver's seat, my ears ringing, my heart pounding so hard I thought my ribs would crack. The acrid smell of burnt rubber and the gunpowder scent from the airbags filled the cabin. Outside, traffic had backed up, the red glow of taillights illuminating the pouring rain, trembling violently. I forced the door open and stumbled out into the downpour. Looking at the crushed front quarter panel and the long black skid marks on the bridge, the reality of death washed over me. A fraction of a second slower, and I would have been crushed under the 18-wheeler, or launched into the East River. The shock faded, immediately replaced by an icy, seething, murderous rage. I didn't call an ambulance. I called Declan, and then I called the NYPD. When the police and a forensic mechanic arrived at the scene, the preliminary inspection under the floodlights confirmed my darkest suspicion. My brake lines had been severed, a clean, deliberate cut with a wire snip. This was no mechanical failure. This was attempted homicide. Sitting in the freezing rain, watching the flatbed tow my ruined car away, my heart turned to flint. Silas's voice echoed in my head. Glass houses shatter easily. They didn't just want to intimidate me. They wanted me in a body bag. They wanted to silence Vanguard's A's and the divorce proceedings forever. The final moral boundary had been obliterated. Any lingering hesitation, any tiny pathetic thought of a quiet settlement left inside me vanished. This war would now end in total annihilation. The accident on the RFK bridge served as a brutal catalyst. It didn't break me. Instead, it forged my will and Declan's into titanium. The incident also generated massive heat. The NYPD officially opened a criminal investigation into attempted murder and vehicular sabotage, though we knew tying it directly to Richard Sterling would be incredibly difficult. The police pressure forced the Sterling family to bunker down. We knew our window was closing. We had to accelerate our offensive before Silas pulled another lethal stunt. Luck finally smiled upon us, not from the detectives, but from Declan's relentless underworld digging. After days of running on pure adrenaline and espresso, Declan came to my townhouse with a flash drive. He told me that through a private investigator he retained, he had secured security camera footage from a luxury condo building across the street from my garage entrance. The camera was angled to catch the sidewalk, but it caught a sliver of the alley leading into my private parking structure. We sat in my study, our eyes glued to his MacBook screen. He repeatedly looped the footage from the night before my accident. The image was grainy due to the rain and the low light, but after staring at it a dozen times, we spotted the ghost. At exactly 3:15 a.m., a man in a dark hoodie stealthily approached the garage gate, bypassed the electronic lock with a cloner, and slipped inside. 10 minutes later, he walked back out. We couldn't clearly see his face, but his hulking build and distinct limp were undeniable. Declan used an enhancement software to clean up a single frame. When the man reached up to pull his hood down, a tiny detail emerged under the glow of a street lamp. On the man's thick wrist was a crude tattoo of a scorpion. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I remembered that night in the garage when Silas had leaned against the pillar. His suit sleeve had ridden up, and I had seen that exact same scorpion. But Declan didn't stop there. He leaned on his criminal defense contacts. By morning, he had a name. The man in the video wasn't Silas himself, but a known enforcer named Jax, a violent felon who did the dirty hands-on work for Silas's crew. Jax had just made parole and was officially on the payroll of a security consulting firm owned by Sterling Apex. The puzzle pieces locked together with a satisfying click. Holding this digital evidence, though perhaps not enough for a district attorney to immediately indict a billionaire, I felt a surge of predatory relief. We had the smoking gun. I looked at Declan, whose tie was loose and who hadn't slept in 3 days, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Declan. If it weren't for you," Declan just smiled, rubbing his tired eyes, his expression incredibly soft when he looked at me. "Between us, Sloane, there's no tally. What I'm doing for you, I'm doing to fulfill my grandfather's dying wish." We're in this together. The intensity in his eyes made my breath catch slightly. Amidst the storm of assassination attempts and corporate espionage, his steadfast presence was an anchor keeping me from drifting into madness. We knew the endgame was approaching, and with our backs to each other, we wouldn't fall. While we were meticulously building a federal case, the Sterling camp was imploding from within. This high-stakes chess game didn't just involve me, Declan, and the Starings. There were other pawns parasites willing to turn on their hosts to survive. Cleo, the runway model Vance had flaunted as his soulmate, was one such parasite. She saw the Sterling Apex stock plummeting to penny stock levels and possessing a predator's instinct. She knew the ship was sinking. One afternoon, I received a call from a block number. The female voice on the other end was sweet, but laced with desperation. "Hi Sloan, it's Cleo, we really need to talk." I arched an eyebrow. Entirely unsurprised, I agreed to meet her. We met at an exclusive, dimly lit speakeasy in Tribeca during off hours. Cleo arrived wearing oversized Celine sunglasses and a trench coat. Looking paranoid, she slid into the leather booth and didn't beat around the bush. "Sloan, I know you're out for blood, and I have something that will hand you Vance's head on a silver platter." With that, she placed her iPhone on the table and tapped play on a voice memo. Vance's voice rang out. The audio slightly muffled, but unmistakably him, and the words were utterly vile. "Relax, Cleo. Sloan is clueless. She's a trust fund brat who just wants to play house. Once the Vanguard deal closes and I secure the $400 million, my dad and I are restructuring the assets offshore. I'll blindside her with divorce papers and she won't see a dime of alimony. Then we take the yacht to Street Barts, just you and me." Next came Cleo's breathy giggle and Vance's disgusting promises. I sat there sipping my sparkling water, my expression entirely blank. Even though I felt absolutely zero love for the man anymore, hearing the premeditated malice, the sheer sociopathy of his plan made my blood run cold. For 3 years I had been married to a smiling shark. Cleo stopped the recording and looked at me, expecting me to break down. "Well, with this, you completely nuke his character in divorce court. The judge will give you whatever you want." I stayed silent, swirling the lime in my glass, waiting for the invoice. She leaned in, a greedy glint in her eyes. "I'll airdrop you this file right now. But I want $5 million. A drop in the bucket for the Vanguard heiress, right?" I looked straight into her heavily contoured face, my gaze unnervingly calm. I felt disgust. Disgust for the man who spoke those words and equal disgust for the opportunist sitting across from me, trying to extort a woman her boyfriend had abused. They truly deserved each other. I realized I would rather burn my money than give a cent to someone like Cleo. I chuckled softly, a genuinely amused sound that wiped the smugness off her face. "Cleo, I appreciate the hustle, but I don't need your tape." Her jaw tightened. "Are you crazy? He was going to leave you with nothing." I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my blazer, "and now he has nothing. I suggest you keep that recording. Who knows? Maybe TMZ will pay you $50 for it when he's indicted." With that, I dropped a $100 bill on the table for the water and walked out, leaving Cleo sitting alone in the gloom, looking panicked. I knew a narcissist like Cleo wouldn't take a loss quietly, and I was counting on her lack of impulse control. The next day, through a few carefully placed calls to friendly journalists at Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, I leaked confirmed rumors that the SEC was looking into Sterling Apex's offshore accounts. The banks were calling in their leverage. The Sterling family accounts were days away from being frozen. The panic in the financial sector was absolute. As I predicted, Cleo broke first. Her fantasy of a $5 million payout from me was dead, and her sugar daddy was about to be federally indicted. To a woman whose entire brand was proximity to wealth, being associated with a broke, disgraced CEO was social suicide. She decided that if she couldn't get a payout, she would get clout. Cleo didn't sell the recording to a tabloid. Instead, she posted the raw audio directly to her millions of followers on Instagram and TikTok, accompanied by a multi-part tearful video alleging that Vance had emotionally manipulated her, lied about his marriage, and trapped her in a toxic dynamic. She weaponized therapy speak to paint herself as the ultimate victim of a narcissistic billionaire. The posts went unimaginably viral. The internet, already salivating over the Vanguard Sterling fallout, treated this like the Super Bowl of drama. The recording of Vance bragging about hiding assets and dumping his wife trended worldwide. The image of the brilliant, philanthropic young CEO collapsed into dust. He was universally branded a sociopath, a fraud, and the internet's most hated man. I sat in my library reading the vicious comments and memes about Vance on my iPad, feeling no vindication, only a dry sense of irony. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I hadn't even had to dirty my hands with the audio. The rats had cannibalized each other. Eleanor, who spent her life obsessed with her social standing, was now the mother of a pariah. I just sat by the fire, sipping wine, watching their digital execution. One evening, during a torrential New York downpour, I was reading briefs from Declan when my head of security buzzed the intercom. Vance had managed to bypass the street gate and was standing outside my front door. I told security to hold. I wanted to look him in the eye one last time to see if there was a shred of humanity left. I stood in the grand foyer, opening the heavy oak door, just enough to look through the wrought iron security gate. Vance stood on the stoop, completely exposed to the freezing rain. His bespoke suit was soaked, plastering to his gaunt frame. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the twitchy desperation of a cornered animal. Seeing me, he grabbed the iron bars, his face pale, eyes bloodshot. "Sloane, please tell your guys to let me in. Just 5 minutes, I beg you." His voice cracked, barely audible over the rain hitting the pavement. I didn't press the buzzer. I stood safely inside the warm foyer, looking at him like an exhibit in a museum of failures. "My lawyers told you to direct all communication to them, Vance. We have nothing to say." We do. He nodded frantically. Water streaming down his face, masking whatever tears he was trying to fake. "Sloane, I am so sorry. I'm a piece of garbage. I lost my mind. The tape, it was just locker room talk to shut Cleo up. I swear I always loved you." I actually laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. "Loved me? You showed your love by letting your mother hit me in public. By parading a mistress. By plotting to hide your assets offshore so I'd be left destitute." He gripped the bars harder, his knuckles white. "It was the pressure, Sloane. You don't know what it's like. My father, the board, the debt. They expected me to be a ruthless killer in the boardroom. I had to project power. And Cleo, she was just a distraction from the stress. It meant nothing." I listened to his pathetic monologue, a masterclass in gaslighting and deflecting blame. He hadn't changed. He was just sorry he got caught. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice cutting through the rain like glass. "Are you done, Vance? Because the saddest part of all this isn't the cheating or the theft. It's that even now, shivering on my porch, you're still a coward. You blame your father, the board, the stress. A real man would own his betrayal. If you loved me, you would have defended me. If you respected me, you wouldn't have plotted to steal from me. Save your tears for the federal judge." I reached out and slammed the heavy oak door shut, locking the deadbolt. I didn't look back to see him standing in the rain. The chapter was closed. I thought that after the leaked audio and his pathetic display on my doorstep, the Starings would finally hire crisis PR and go quiet. I underestimated the sheer unhinged narcissism of Eleanor Sterling. To her, public perception and avoiding prison were worth any lie. Her final desperate maneuver was so sociopathic, I couldn't have anticipated it. She weaponized the one thing society views as sacred. One morning, my phone rang with a call from a distant aunt in Connecticut. Her voice was breathless with scandalous excitement. "Sloane, darling, why didn't you tell us the good news? Dealing with a divorce is one thing, but hiding a pregnancy." I froze, my coffee cup halting halfway to my mouth. "Auntie? What on earth are you talking about?" Eleanor Sterling just did an exclusive sit-down with Page 6. She showed them the ultrasound photos. She said you're 10 weeks pregnant with Vance's baby and that she's begging you to think of the child and stop this hostile divorce. The room spun. I hung up the phone, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. They were using a fictitious unborn child to manipulate public sympathy and trap me in the marriage. Eleanor was trying to paint me as a vindictive, hormonally unbalanced woman willing to destroy her baby's father and grandparents just for spite. I immediately called Declan. He was already reading the article. Within hours, his private investigators tracked the source of the leak. Eleanor, using her vast checkbook, had bribed a concierge doctor at an elite Upper East Side clinic. Together, they forged an airtight medical file, positive blood tests, high HCG levels, and a stolen sonogram image labeled with my name showing a 10-week fetus. Looking at the digital copies Declan procured, I felt a rage so pure it burned white-hot. This woman who had physically assaulted me was now playing the weeping grandmother on national media to save her son from prison. The court of public opinion is fickle and vicious. Once Page 6 published the exclusive, the narrative shifted violently. Eleanor appeared on morning talk shows, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, begging me to come home for the sake of her grandchild. She claimed the entire Vanguard fallout was just a horrible misunderstanding blown out of proportion by my pregnancy hormones. Online, the trolls turned their vitriol toward me. Wow, she's pregnant and still trying to bankrupt her baby daddy. Psycho, she's just a spoiled heiress using the courts to punish him. Think of the kid. You selfish brat, the pressure was suffocating. Paparazzi camped outside my townhouse, but I did not crack. The bigger the lie, the harder the fall. Eleanor wanted to break my spirit, but she had just handed me the rope to hang her with. I didn't issue a frantic Twitter denial. In a media war, words are useless against medical evidence. You have to drop a nuclear bomb of truth. I sat in my mother's private office. Margot Kensington looked at me completely unbothered by the media circus. Let them dig the hole a little deeper, Sloane. Then we bury them. The press conference was held at the Vanguard Holdings corporate auditorium in Manhattan. The room was packed wall-to-wall with journalists, financial reporters, and paparazzi cameras flashing like strobe lights. They were all expecting a tearful breakdown, a messy reality TV-style confrontation about the pregnancy. I walked onto the stage, flanked by my mother and Declan. I wore a razor-sharp ivory Tom Ford pantsuit, my hair sleek, my posture impeccably straight. I looked nothing like a distressed pregnant housewife. The room fell dead silent as I adjusted the microphone. I looked directly into the lenses of the network cameras. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, before I address the fabricated tabloids regarding my personal life, Vanguard Holdings has a major corporate announcement. I pressed a clicker and the massive screen behind me lit up with architectural renderings. Vanguard Holdings is committing $50 million to develop a comprehensive affordable housing and community center initiative. And specifically, this project will be built in the Hudson Valley on the exact acreage that Sterling Apex unlawfully attempted to seize for a luxury resort. We are returning the land to the community, building sustainable housing for the working-class families who were displaced by corporate greed. The room erupted. The financial reporters scrambled to type. I was publicly castrating Sterling's legacy and turning their stolen land into a monument of philanthropy. I raised a hand, silencing the room. Now, regarding the rumors that have dominated the news cycle, the claims made by Eleanor Sterling that I am pregnant. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing, categorically, provably, and pathologically false. A murmur of shock rippled through the press corps. But the ultrasound, the doctor's records, a reporter shouted from the front row. I didn't answer. I stepped back and let Declan take the podium. He didn't smile. He pressed a button and an audio file played over the auditorium surround sound. It was a wiretap Declan's investigators had legally obtained through a whistleblower at the clinic. Listen to me, doctor. Eleanor's unmistakable haughty voice echoed in the room. I don't care how you fake the sonogram. Just put her name on it and make it look 10 weeks along. The wire transfer for $500,000 will be in your Cayman account by noon. Then the doctor's nervous voice. Mrs. Sterling, this is medical fraud. I could lose my license. If you don't do it, you'll lose a lot more than your license. Eleanor snapped. Once the media runs this, Sloane won't dare divorce Vance. The public backlash will force her to drop the lawsuits. Just print the damn photo. The audio cut out. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, deafening shock. The truth was naked, hideous, and undeniable. The journalist faces morphed from eager gossip-mongers to furious investigators. They realized they had been played as pawns in a felony fraud scheme. But Declan wasn't finished. Eleanor Sterling's actions constitute criminal fraud, extortion, and defamation, Declan stated, his voice booming. The Manhattan District Attorney has already received this evidence, but the corruption of Sterling Apex runs far deeper than tabloids. Declan gestured to the wings, and a group of people walked onto the stage. They were older, wearing simple, worn clothes, looking out of place under the bright lights, but carrying a profound dignity. They were the Hudson Valley farmers and residents, Declan's neighbors, whom Richard Sterling had destroyed 10 years ago. An elderly man leaning on a cane took the microphone. His voice shook, but his anger was clear. He detailed the terror campaign, the poisoned dogs, the smashed greenhouses, the fraudulent appraisals, and the legal bullying that forced them off their ancestral land. He spoke of his neighbor who died of a stroke from the stress. There were audible gasps from the press. Some reporters stopped taking pictures, genuinely moved. It was no longer a Manhattan society scandal. It was a devastating indictment of systemic abuse. I stepped forward, putting an arm around the old man. I stand here today not as a victim of a bad marriage, but as an advocate for the real victims. Vanguard's new housing initiative is the first step in restoring what the Sterlings stole. Thank you. The fallout was apocalyptic. What happened in that auditorium triggered a chain reaction that obliterated the Sterling family. By 6:00 p.m. that evening, the FBI and the NYPD executed coordinated raids. I watched it live on CNN from the comfort of my living room. Federal agents swarmed the Sterling Apex headquarters in Midtown, carrying out boxes of hard drives. Richard Sterling, the untouchable titan of real estate, was walked out of his Park Avenue penthouse in handcuffs, looking frail and terrified. Eleanor was arrested at a luxury spa in the Hamptons, screaming at the arresting officers as they shoved her into the back of an unmarked cruiser. Her perfectly coiffed hair ruined. Vance was apprehended by federal marshals, trying to board a private jet at Teterboro Airport. He didn't fight. The footage showed him staring blankly at the tarmac. A broken man who finally realized his daddy's money couldn't buy his way out of a federal indictment. The charges were staggering: RICO violations, wire fraud, medical fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Sterling Apex filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy the next morning. In the weeks that followed, my life settled into a strange, quiet peace. The media storm moved on to the next scandal. I spent my days reading, working on the Hudson Valley architectural designs, and taking long walks through Central Park. I was learning to breathe again. One rainy Sunday afternoon, while sorting through boxes from my childhood bedroom, I opened an old cedar chest. Inside were keepsakes from my late father, Arthur. He was a brilliant structural engineer who had died in a tragic scaffolding collapse on a construction site when I was 15. The official report called it a freak accident. My mother had been devastated, and I had buried the grief deep in my psyche. I pulled out a faded Polaroid of my dad, holding me on his shoulders at a Mets game. As I stared at his smiling face, a jarring, terrifying memory surfaced. I remembered the weeks before he died. He had been agitated, pacing the house, arguing on the phone about load-bearing stress and criminal negligence. I frantically dug through the chest until I found his old leather-bound site journals. I flipped to the final entries from 15 years ago, the project he was managing, the contractor overseeing the site. My blood ran cold. The holding company listed on the site plans was a subsidiary of Sterling Apex. Back then, Richard Sterling was just an up-and-coming developer cutting corners to build his empire. I took the journal downstairs and showed my mother. When she saw the subsidiary name, the color drained from her face. "Mom," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Dad's accident. Was it a Sterling site?" She slowly sat down, clutching the journal. "Yes, it was Richard's first major high-rise. Your father was the chief structural engineer. He was meticulous, Sloan. He never made mistakes. I never believed it was just an accident. But the OSHA inspectors cleared the site, and we had no proof. The grief I had buried for over a decade ignited into a roaring inferno. What if my father's death wasn't a tragedy? What if it was a murder? I didn't tell Declan immediately. I needed to look the devil in the eye. I arranged a visitor's pass to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where Vance was being held without bail. The federal holding facility was bleak, smelling of bleach and despair. I sat down behind the thick plexiglass in the visitation room. Vance walked in wearing a khaki prison jumpsuit. He looked 10 years older, hollowed out, the arrogance entirely scrubbed from his soul. He picked up the heavy black phone receiver. I picked up mine. "Did you come to gloat?" he asked, his voice raspy. "You won, Sloan. You took everything." "I didn't come to gloat, Vance. I came to ask you a question about 15 years ago about my father, Arthur." Vance's eyes darted away, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The site collapsed. The one Richard built. My father was going to blow the whistle on your dad's cheap materials, wasn't he?" Vance stared at me, his chest heaving. In his absolute despair, facing decades in federal prison, perhaps he realized he had nothing left to lose. Or perhaps he just wanted to drag his father down with him. He let out a hollow, psychotic laugh. "An accident? You think my dad built $1 billion empire playing by the rules? You're naive, Sloan." He leaned close to the plexiglass, his breath fogging the barrier. "My father doesn't just owe your family money. He owes you blood." Vance hung up the phone and walked back to his cell, leaving me staring at the glass. I left the prison, the cold wind whipping off the East River. It was no longer a corporate vengeance plot. It was a homicide investigation hidden for 15 years. I immediately called Declan and brought him the journal. He mobilized his entire investigative team. Reopening a 15-year-old construction fatality was nearly impossible. Evidence is paved over, witnesses move on or die. But we found a thread in my father's journal. He repeatedly mentioned a site foreman named Harlan Graves. My dad wrote that Heron was a good man, but terrified of Richard Sterling's thugs. If we could find Heron Graves, we might find the truth. It took Declan's team 2 weeks, utilizing skip tracers and tax records to locate him. Harlan had quit construction the day after my father died, sold his house in Queens, and disappeared into the Adirondack Mountains upstate, living off the grid. Declan and I drove 4 hours north into the deep woods. We found Harlan's modest log cabin sitting by a frozen lake. An old man with a thick white beard and weathered skin was chopping firewood on the porch. When we approached and introduced ourselves, the color washed out of his face. At first, he refused to speak, citing his age and poor memory. The fear of Richard Sterling was still hardwired into his brain. I took out the Polaroid of my father and laid it on the wooden table. "Mr. Graves, I am Arthur's daughter. I didn't come to punish you. I just want to know why my father didn't come home. For 15 years, my mother and I have lived with a ghost." "Please give my dad peace," Declan gently added. "Richard Sterling is in federal custody, Heron. He can't hurt you anymore, but we need your testimony to make sure he never sees daylight again." Harlan looked at the photo, his hands trembling. He covered his face and began to weep the heavy, agonizing sobs of a man who had carried a crushing guilt for a decade and a half. He confessed everything. Harlan explained that Richard Sterling had ordered the use of substandard counterfeit steel for the main scaffolding to cut millions in costs. My father Arthur discovered the fraud. He threatened to go straight to the Department of Buildings and the press, which would have ruined Richard. The night before the accident, Harlan saw Silas Richards' fixer and a crew of men tampering with the primary load-bearing joints on the scaffolding. Harlan was threatened with his family's lives if he spoke up. The next morning, my father went up for his inspection. The rigging gave way instantly. Richard paid off the corrupt safety inspectors and wired a massive sum into an offshore account for Heron to buy his silence and disappear. I sat on the porch, staring out at the frozen lake, tears streaming down my face. My father, a man of uncompromising integrity, was murdered for profit. With Harlan's sworn affidavit, Declan approached the U.S. Attorney's office. They obtained a highly restricted search warrant for a secondary off-the-book storage facility Richard kept in New Jersey. Inside a fireproof safe hidden behind drywall, the FBI found the Holy Grail, Richard Sterling's personal ledger. It wasn't just accounting. It was a paranoid man's insurance policy as it is against his own fixers. It detailed the payoffs to the inspectors, the wire transfer to Heron, and a chilling entry on the day my father died. Arthur wouldn't listen to reason, had Clear's throat, Silas handled the scaffolding, a tragic cost of doing business. One body paves the foundation. When Declan read that entry to me over the phone, I didn't cry. I felt an absolute, profound serenity. The monster was finally trapped in the light. The federal trial of Richard Sterling became the media event of the decade. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was packed with reporters, the displaced Hudson Valley families, and the ghosts of Richard's victims. My mother and I sat in the front row. I wore a tailored black suit, my face an impenetrable mask. Beside me, Declan sat as my legal counsel, his presence a steady anchor. Richard Sterling looked like a corpse. The billionaire aura had rotted away, leaving only a frail, terrified old man in an orange jumpsuit. Eleanor sobbed hysterically in the gallery. Vance refused to make eye contact with anyone. Faced with the ledger, Harlan's testimony, and the mountain of financial fraud evidence, the defense crumbled. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. Richard Sterling was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and fraud. Vance received 20 years for his role in the corporate extortion and offshore evasion. Eleanor was given 5 years for medical fraud and witness tampering. As the bailiffs led Richard away, the gallery erupted in applause. My mother pulled me into a fierce embrace, weeping tears of pure relief. I looked up at the high ceiling of the courtroom, knowing my father could finally rest. During the bankruptcy liquidation, Vanguard Holdings shocked Wall Street by purchasing the entirety of Sterling Apex's assets. Everyone assumed we would dissolve the company and erase the stained name from the earth. But I didn't. I kept the Apex name for the new subsidiary. I purged the entire Sowite, implemented strict ethical oversight, and transformed a symbol of corporate sociopathy into an engine for community development. The name wasn't the crime. The men who wielded it were. My first act as the new head of Apex was to travel back to the Hudson Valley. We didn't just build the affordable housing, we tracked down every family Sterling had displaced. I sat in their living rooms and handed them newly drafted deeds. We sold them back their ancestral plots for exactly $1. Alongside massive financial restitution packages drawn directly from the liquidated Sterling estates. When an elderly woman, Declan's grandmother's best friend, held the deed to her farm and wept with joy holding my hands, I knew I had found my life's purpose. I had taken the weapon used to destroy my family and turned it into a plowshare. Life settled into a beautiful, productive rhythm. The Vanguard Apex housing initiatives flourished. I felt lighter, unburdened by the need to prove my worth to people who couldn't see my soul. Throughout it all, Declan was my constant. He was my brilliant legal mind, my confidant, and my partner in dismantling empires. We worked late nights over blueprints and legal briefs, sharing takeout Chinese food and easy laughter. The trauma of the past had bonded us, but the shared vision for the future was what made us inseparable. One brisk autumn evening, Declan and I were walking through Central Park. The leaves had turned into brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The city skyline twinkled through the bare branches. It was quiet, peaceful. Declan stopped near the Bow Bridge. He turned to me, the amber light from a lamppost reflecting in his eyes. "Sloane, you know I've always admired you, even back at Columbia." I smiled, my heart doing a strange, lovely flutter. "Really? You spent all your time buried in tort law textbooks. I thought you barely noticed I was there." He laughed softly, stepping closer. "I noticed everything, but I was just a scholarship kid trying to survive. And you were this brilliant, beautiful force of nature. I never thought I'd have the right to stand beside you." He took my hands in his grip warm and calloused. "Sloane, walking through fire with you these past months. It's been the honor of my life. You are the strongest woman I've ever known." I realize now that what I feel isn't just admiration or friendship. I love you, Sloane. I always have. The confession wasn't a shock, but it filled me with a radiant, overwhelming joy. After years of manipulation and transactional affection, I finally felt a love that was pure, protective, and built on profound mutual respect. I didn't need to say a word. I just stepped into his arms, burying my face in his coat, feeling the steady, honest beat of his heart. Years passed. The storm that had ravaged my life was now just a chapter in a textbook on corporate ethics. One afternoon, I received a letter processed through the federal penitentiary system. The handwriting on the envelope belonged to Vance. I sat at my desk looking at it. I didn't feel the old spike of anger or anxiety. I just felt a distant curiosity. I opened it to finally close the door. The letter was short, the handwriting shaky. He didn't beg for an appeal or ask for money. Sloane, sitting in an 810 cell gives a man too much time to think. I see clearly now what a monster I became trying to chase my father's approval. I threw away the only real thing in my life. I hear you and Declan are married, and the Hudson Project is a massive success. I am genuinely glad. You deserved a partner, not a parasite. I'm paying my debt, and I know I deserve every second of it. Do you remember our first date in Central Park? You dropped a little silver hairpin. I kept it in my pocket for years, thinking I had caught something beautiful, but I was the one who crushed it. I'm sorry, be happy. I folded the letter and dropped it into the paper shredder. I felt no lingering malice, only a quiet pity for a man who traded his soul for a facade. Forgiveness wasn't about telling him he was absolved. It was about the fact that his memory no longer had the power to make my pulse race. On a bright Sunday morning, Declan and I drove up to the Hudson Valley to visit the completed community project. The old orchards had been revitalized alongside the sustainable, beautifully designed homes. The sound of children playing echoed across the fields. Families were browsing a local farmers market set up in the town square. We walked hand in hand along the paved trails. People waved and smiled at us, not with the sycophantic fear of Manhattan socialites, but with genuine warm gratitude. I realized that true power isn't the ability to destroy someone at a gala or the capacity to hoard millions in offshore accounts. True power is the ability to take the shattered pieces of your life and build a shelter for someone else. Declan squeezed my hand, looking out over the vibrant living community we had fought so hard to protect. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Hayes? I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. I'm thinking that revenge is exhausting, but building a beautiful life, that's the best victory of all. We stood there together under the clear upstate sky, leaving the ghosts of the past behind, ready for whatever the future held.